So, what is life? And how did life start? Now, these are some of the most fundamental questions that have troubled scientists and philosophers for centuries. In this presentation, we can definitely look at some really good evidence to explain how life started. But the more science discovers, the harder it's actually become to really clearly define exactly what life actually is. But this presentation is all about the origins of life and how life started. So, before a man called Charles Darwin came along, most people believed that humans were special, that they had been created separately from the other creatures on Earth. They believed that God had created all life independently. But things changed with Darwin's book on the Origin of Species. And there was, in one of his sketchbooks actually, in 1837, there's this brilliant drawing of the tree of life, Darwin's tree of life. The idea that all life is connected, the idea that life started and life forms have evolved and changed and become new organisms, new species. We now know Darwin was right. You know, if you look at the top of that sketchbook, I love it how he's just written the words, "I think." Well, actually, he's been proved right now. And we've got lots and lots of evidence to support the tree of life. And we've now created a hugely detailed version of the tree of life. It can be downloaded and viewed for free online. And there's some really good tree of life resources, interactive ones where you can zoom in and find any organism on the tree of life and look at its ancestry. And I'll put all that information in the description below. So, what we know is that all life on Earth descended from one common ancestor. And we call that common ancestor LUCA, L-U-C-A, which stands for the last universal common ancestor. And we've got some really good evidence to support it. And we're going to look at three major things in this presentation. The first thing is called the universality of the genetic code. The second, the conservation of key certain molecules. And the third is the process of protein degradation. So let's start with the universality of the genetic code. Well, what is the genetic code? Well, the genetic code is basically the way that your DNA codes to make certain proteins. The way it works is that your DNA has a sequence of bases, A's, T's, C's and G's. And this base sequence is converted into something called messenger RNA. And this messenger RNA is then read at 3 bases at a time, triplets. We call them codons. And each codon codes for a particular amino acid. These amino acids then join together and that makes your protein. Now the interesting thing is that this works the same in all living organisms. It doesn't matter whether you're a bacteria or a carrot or a gorilla, the genetic code works the same in all of them. And that suggests that life originated from one particular ancestor, and the way that the genetic code worked in that cell has just been passed on throughout all of evolution to all of the other living organisms. The second piece of evidence is the conservation of key molecules. For example, a molecule of protein called cytochrome C. You can find it in all aerobic cells. It doesn't matter if it's archaea, bacteria, eukaryotic cells, whatever they are, they're going to have some cytochrome C. And its structure has been studied in all these different organisms and compared and analysed. And we found that it was basically identical in all living organisms. It's what we call a highly conserved molecule. And again, it's really strong evidence to suggest that all life originated from one common ancestor. Another molecule that's been highly conserved is ubiquitin. It's a really small protein, just 76 amino acids. But humans and yeast, which obviously pretty far removed from each other, you would think, actually share 96% of this amino acid sequence of their ubiquitin. ATP as well is the universal energy carrier in all living organisms, in all cells. And again, that suggests that that mechanism, that metabolic pathway sort of evolved in the first common ancestor and just been passed on through life. So it suggests that there was this common ancestor. And the third piece of evidence is the idea of protein degradation. Proteins get broken down in a cell by something called a proteasome. We looked at it briefly in the eukaryotic cell organelle section of the course. The way it works is it breaks down proteins that have been tagged with something called ubiquitin, that molecule we just looked at a minute ago. And the mechanism for this process is also very highly conserved. It works the same in all living things. Basically, lots of copies of ubiquitin get added to the target proteins that needed to be broken down. These ubiquitinated proteins then get recognized by proteasomes, which have proteases found in the 20S particle, and these break down the protein into their constituent amino acids. And that works the same in all living things. So, what happened after LUCA? LUCA was the first common ancestor, the first form of life. But when did life get really interesting? What happened next? Well, we know that life began about 3.8 billion years ago, but we also know that at that point there was no oxygen. So you could only have anaerobic bacteria around. It took a long time for oxygen to occur. Basically, you needed photosynthetic bacteria to evolve, which we think happened about 3.2 billion years ago. And once they evolved, they started making oxygen. Oxygen levels increased, and we've got that evidence from analysing rocks, analysing the oxygen content in rocks. And we reckon that there was enough oxygen around in the atmosphere to support aerobic respiration about 2.7 billion years ago. So it must have been around this time that the first eukaryotic cells originated. But how do you get a eukaryotic cell from a prokaryotic cell? Bearing in mind that eukaryotic cells, the major difference really is that they've got these organelles, things like mitochondria and chloroplasts, and they've got a nuclear envelope and a nucleus. Well, the theory is that they originated by a process called endosymbiosis. What this means is that an early prokaryote engulfed a bacterium capable of aerobic respiration, which eventually turned into what we now know as a mitochondria. So basically, what we think of now as a mitochondria was actually a living organism all by itself, a little bacteria that was doing aerobic respiration, and another bacteria engulfed it and incorporated it inside its cytoplasm. We also think that an early prokaryote engulfed photosynthetic cyanobacteria, which would then be the early ancestors of chloroplasts. Now, we've got loads of evidence to support this. It's very simple. If you look at the structures of mitochondria and chloroplasts, then it's obvious that they must have been prokaryotes. I mean, they've got so many features that suggest that they were their own living organisms. For one, they've got their own little circular loop of DNA. Why would they have their own little DNA? None of our other organelles have their own little bit of DNA in them like that, that's separate from the rest of the cell. They also have a double membrane, which suggests that they had their own membrane, and then when they got engulfed by the other cell and went in by endocytosis, it created the second membrane around them. They're also the same size as bacteria. They replicate by binary fission, like bacteria do. They also have ribosomes, and their ribosomes are not eukaryotic ribosomes. They are prokaryotic ribosomes, they're 70S ribosomes. And they also have really similar biochemical processes to bacteria and similar enzymes. So there's all this evidence that says, look, these organelles that we now have and rely on eukaryotic cells, chloroplasts and mitochondria, were actually once their own separate living organisms. So we talked about LUCA, the origin of life. We talked about when eukaryotic cells evolved and how they evolved. And the last thing to talk about in this presentation is multicellularity. Are there any advantages to being multicellular, or is it better to maybe be unicellular? So multicellularity, as it's known, evolved many times in independent lineages. It's allowed for far more complex organisms to exist. A living group called the Volvocalis algae show possible transitional forms through unicellular to forming small colonies and multicellular organisms. Now, although being multicellular means you get a greater complexity, it doesn't always necessarily mean a greater success. In fact, unicellular organisms have been around much longer, they live in much more extreme environments, and they make up more than half of the world's biomass. So I think there are both advantages and disadvantages to being either multicellular or unicellular, and we'll look at some of those now. Well, multicellular organisms have specialised differentiated cells that group together to form tissues that can then carry out specific functions. Giving different jobs to different cells so that the organism becomes more than just the sum of its parts is called a division of labour, and it's allowed organisms to become much more complex. You can say, right, this cell do this job, this cell do this job, this cell do this job, and then you can form really complex systems if you divide up the roles like that. There's three sort of really clear examples of where you'll see this during your study of this course. The digestive system is one. If you look at the different tissues, the four regions that make up the digestive system, the mucosa, the inner submucosa, the muscularis externa and the serosa, they each have these specific roles in digestion. They each have a particular job to do. And even within that, you've got these specialized cells, things like chief cells. Or the immune system's got all these different specialized leukocytes, white blood cells. And again, each one has a different role to play, a different job to do. And that can make a really complex system that couldn't exist if you didn't divide up the jobs like that. Plant transport is another example, looking at the plants, looking at xylem, looking at phloem, and how these tissues mean that trees, for example, can exploit resources from different locations more successfully than potentially a unicellular organism could. Now, it's all well and good saying, right, we've got all these different cells doing different jobs, division of labour, but you need some kind of coordination system. You need some way of communicating and make sure all those cells are doing the right jobs at the right time. In animals, it'd be the endocrine nervous system, and in plants, things like growth factors or plant growth hormones. But this is an advantage because what it's allowed to happen is multicellular organisms can be much more independent from their environment. Because they have these communication systems, which means that they can maintain the right conditions in their cells, homeostasis, it's allowed them to be more independent from their environment. Now, multicellularity is also interesting if you're thinking about size of organisms, because one of the limiting factors of unicellular organisms is that they can't get any much bigger because of surface area to volume ratio. If a cell gets bigger, its surface area to volume ratio decreases. If your surface area to volume ratio decreases, then the rate of diffusion decreases, and you can't get enough materials into the cell, and you can't get rid of waste quick enough to support a larger cell. Multicellular organisms have got around this problem by evolving exchange and transport systems to get the required nutrients and oxygen to the cells and remove waste effectively. So, are these factors really advantages or disadvantages? Is it better to be unicellular? Is it better to be multicellular? Being bigger means that you need more substances to live and you make more waste, but you can be more complex. But what's the purpose of life? Is it to be as complex as possible? No, I think this comes down to the fact that being able to survive and reproduce is probably the function of life, as it were, and both of these organisms have evolved adaptations and advantages that allow them to do that, to survive and to reproduce. Now, as always, there's some extension questions to have a think about. And this topic, there is a huge amount that you could research on the origins of life and early evolution. So there's some great things to go and have a look at here.